18 months ago, Kansas Policy Institute launched an ambitious effort to try to create a permanent freedom infrastructure in Kansas. We wanted to have a network of organizations that share our beliefs in student-focused education and the constitutional principles of limited government and personal freedom. Today, we're pleased to announce the kickoff to start another organization as part of that infrastructure, which will be the Kansas Justice Institute. It's modeled after the Institute for Justice, which is the national law firm for liberty. IJ litigates to limit the size and scope of government power and to ensure that all Americans have the right to control their own destinies as free and responsible members of society. The Kansas Justice Institute will do much of what IJ does, including school choice issues. And unfortunately, the way the current discussion over school choice and particularly the school funding issue in Kansas is going, Kansas Justice Institute's first client may well be low-income students who are being deprived of the education they deserve because schools refuse to be held accountable. Many legislators have shown no interest in holding schools accountable for outcomes, even though the Supreme Court says outcomes matter more than money. They even said that the lowest, that only about 25% of students are not performing as expected and may need some more money. Schools react to that by saying we want upwards of $1 billion for all students, and they reject every opportunity to be held accountable so that students actually come first. Who knows how this legislature is going to turn out, but the way it's started right now, you've had a small majority of the House K-12 Budget Committee reject every opportunity to do anything remotely in conjunction with the court's ruling. The court says funding has to be reasonably calculated so that students can meet the Rose capacities. Every effort on reasonably calculation that has been introduced has been rejected by a slight majority of that committee. The schools want nothing to do with funding being reasonably calculated. They just want a pile of money added. Every effort to hold schools accountable, completely rejected. And this is just, it's critical that so if we go back to court the next time, and there probably will be a next time no matter what happens, we hope that it's about the thing that matters or should matter, and that's student achievement, not just asking for a big pile of money. And so I want to introduce our next speaker, Mike O'Neill. He's an attorney, former Speaker of the House. Mike will briefly address students' ability to sue for not having a good education. Mike?
Thank you, Dave. And I know in the interest of time, I'll try to keep this brief, but we're in remarkable times. If you look at the history of school litigation, you have the interesting phenomena of cause of action to ask for more money, but then no cause of action for the consequence of failing to educate individuals when by the time they graduate from high school. And going back in Kansas to 1993, the court essentially there indicated that there is no cause of action for what they would consider to be educational malpractice or a failure on the part of the education system to deliver on the promise of education. What's interesting is the Kansas, and Kansas is really what we're talking about here today. In Kansas, that landscape has changed dramatically since that 1993 decision. No less than the realization that although the United States Supreme Court has rejected the notion that public education, K-12, is a constitutional right, the state of Kansas has recognized public education in the state, K-12, to be a constitutional right that every student in the state has. And so with that, and with the new definition of adequacy, the new statutory standards that the court has said that we now have to follow, there are enough duties in there that there's no longer an argument that can be made that the state is immune from liability for failure to deliver on the promise of education that the Supreme Court has said is a constitutional right. And so with the court acknowledging, and I appreciate their acknowledgement, may disagree with what they may end up saying in terms of dollars, but acknowledging it's now not only about inputs, but it's about the outcomes, and the funding mechanism needs to be reasonably calculated to lead to the results that are in the statute. Acknowledging that about 25% of the students are not getting that, although they are being socially promoted, they're getting their diplomas and then facing either remedial or developmental coursework at the college level or not having good career opportunities. It gives rise, and in an environment where there really, for many students, no true choice for those that are at risk programs that are not succeeding. Schools are not using peer-reviewed and tested and successful at-risk programs. That those students, really, it's not about money for them. It's about targeting the resources and actually getting the job done with the money that is allocated to them. And so if the question is, can they? The answer to that is, can they access the courts for that? The answer is yes. And the Kansas Supreme Court has essentially opened the door to that very, invited, if you will, that very type of analysis. And to us, it really is about getting the job done. With the resources you have, whether it's more resources, whether it's less resources, get back to the core mission of education, and that is getting these kids college and career ready. And for those kids that are not getting that constitutional privilege, they should have access to remedies that would make sure that happens, whether it's within the public school system or outside the public school system.
Thanks, Mike. Mike mentioned at-risk funding, and one of the sad ironies of the school funding history in Kansas is that when the state increased funding for at-risk from roughly $50 million to about $400 million between 2005 and 2000, where we are now, they forgot to say, and you can only spend the money for that purpose. And so a lot of that money, as one of our scholars found, was spent for other reasons. And so that's another degree of accountability. Because when you do focus on the kids, it works. And our next speaker briefly, and I do mean briefly, this man can talk. I never want to go ahead of him. Wade Moore, he is headmaster of Urban Preparatory Academy in Wichita. It's a small private school that specializes in low-income families. A lot of Wade students have come to him by virtue of the only school choice program that Kansas has. And ironically, of course, the education community wants to shut that down. They want to keep low-income students trapped in the worst performing schools in Kansas. And we think that is just atrocious. We need to have these kids, because when they get the opportunity, they flourish. And it's not about money. Wade spends about a third of what the public schools spend on his kids. And as he will tell you, they do quite well. Wade?
Very briefly. Again, I'm Wade Moore. I'm the president and the founder and dean of the Urban Prep Academy, which is a K-7 school it's a private school for low-income and working-class families. Our students come from different communities across the city. Most of them come from the community where the school is located, and there's one more school there, and that school is on the list of the 99 lowest performing schools in the state. And I would even venture to say that it is probably toward the bottom of failing schools. Recently, there was some articles in the paper about the school and how low the scores were, teacher turnover, and things like that. And so we've gotten some of those students in, and they come to our school, and they 3-4 grade levels behind in reading and in math, 3 or 4 grade levels behind. And we are able to take those students and get them up to their grade level, and some of them are now above grade level. And as Dave has already mentioned, for a third of the cost of what's being spent in the public school system. The majority of third and fourth graders cannot read at grade level. And I don't know why we continue on with a system that will consistently allow children to fail and pass them on like that. And so my thought is that we have to we need and we demand a swift change in the process so that it effectively educates our urban children and all children to achieve so that they can function properly in a global and contemporary society. I believe that it's imperative, regardless of a child's race, gender, place of residence, socioeconomic status, that they learn the concepts and the strategies that are necessary for them to develop and succeed. And we know that this is not happening. I know firsthand by the students that we get in. So we want and we demand that this system be rebuilt to allow students to excel in life. If students are not excelling in education, they won't excel in life. We all know that education began as a system in America, what we can equate it to as private schools. And though they were often supported by public funds, they were typically operated by other organizations. And they would educate their children in their town and in their village. And they educated some of the most noted inventors, business leaders, and entrepreneurs. And it seems like that we've lost that edge with our educational system and getting children to really dream and getting them to really believe that they could be the next greatest inventor. They could be the next greatest business person. They could be the next greatest politician. They could be the next greatest entrepreneur. And so we want to get that edge back. And I believe that we get that edge back by getting our children the best possible education that we can get them and allowing parents to really choose their child's educational journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Wade. You know, it's unfortunate that we have, perhaps understandable, but very unfortunate that the assumption seems to be that if we just spend more, things will get better. Frankly, if that was what it took, there would be no achievement gaps in this country. We've seen tremendous funding increases, not only in Kansas, but across the nation. And it would be great if we could all work together and focus on the system, focus on the students so that they get the education they deserve. That's not what we've seen happen. And so, unfortunately, we want to make sure that that students have that opportunity. And if going to court is what it takes to get the state's attention, then we're prepared to do that on behalf of students. And of course, that's not, school choice is not the only issue. We would be working on all the same issues, I would imagine, that the Institute for Justice handles, private property rights, occupational licensing, any kinds of property tax issues, a wide variety of things, that civil asset forfeiture. We'd work on, Kansas Justice Institute would work on quite a few other issues, but there may be nothing more important than ensuring that our students get an education. And if the state and the school districts aren't going to do that, then we want to have an opportunity so that the students have someone representing them. And with that, we'll just stop and stand for questions.
Do you have a motion typed up? Or how do you intervene?
Excuse me?
How do you intervene in
Or are you talking about filing a new case?
in the case?
Oh, well, first of all, I mean, Mike could maybe address this, but basically you have to, Mike, you want to talk about timing and so forth?
Yeah, the thinking is not intervening in the current litigation, if that's what your question was, Martin. It's just, if there's going to be future, look at it this way, if there's going to be future litigation, and none of us like litigation, yours truly has talked about that for years and years, but if there is going to be, it ought to be about the right things and directed to the right individuals, and that is the fundamental idea of actually delivering on the promise of education, no matter what you spend, but actually delivering on that. And now we've moved away from inputs into outcomes, and so everything is moving in the right direction. And now we just need to have those children have the opportunity to pursue all of their options in order to have that promise delivered.
So you have no lawsuit planned right now?
No.
So who's going to be the lawyer? You?
No,
You
not
have
necessarily.
anyone hired?
No, Sam, we don't have anyone hired. We're announcing the kickoff. It takes a while. We've helped launch 2 other nonprofits, Success for Kansas Students and the Sentinel. We put together a joint venture with the state chamber called GetTheFactsKansas.com. That was a really easy one to do. It takes time to raise money. And so this is something that probably wouldn't get started as an organization until sometime next year. But perhaps if intervention and intervention in a good way, it's making the announcement that this is coming today, so that legislators hopefully will start focusing on doing what is right for students and not so much for institutions. So this is just we just think that we've been talking about doing this, and we think that given the way that these discussions have been going this year about school funding, that it was time that we said, okay, there's a real need. We need to get started on this.
So if the school districts get the money, there's no improvement, is that a misdemeanor? Or what? Where
Well,
does this go?
That would depend. I mean, it would depend on, you'd have to, I would imagine again, I'm not an attorney, but you would need to wait a year or so after a new formula gets in place and be able to demonstrate that, say, schools got the money, but they didn't use it they used it for other purposes.
Test results. might
There's
be
test
taken off.
results. If they take away the safety valve for tax credit scholarships, if they refuse to do something to allow students to, one of the things we'd like to see at Kansas Policy Institute is to have schools graded in a way that everybody understands what that means based on their student achievement scores from the state assessment. So grade every building A through F. Everybody knows what A through F means. If you improve a letter grade or you had an A and maintain it, then by formula, everybody in that building would get a bonus. But if you're an F school, then everybody in that building, the students, are allowed to leave with an education savings account. Taxpayer money can follow the student. So you provide an incentive for improvement. You also provide an incentive to improve at the bottom end. If you don't bring those scores up, if those kids aren't getting their education, well, then they need to be able to leave and go somewhere, whether it's to a school like Wade's or somewhere else. Could be another public school. You have to empower the students.
And the students would take their state, whatever the state appropriation for their education is, with them.
However that legislation was written, yes, then they would be able to take that education savings account and go wherever. So that way, at least the state is saying, if the schools aren't doing, for whatever reason, they're trying, but they're not doing it. If the kids aren't getting the education they need in the public school, the state is providing a safety valve for them to go somewhere else.
Are you looking at improvement or actual targeted outcome? Like,
In the example I gave,
for what you're proposing?
Okay.
If you're saying you're going to give them a year, are you going to look at students who improve some? Or are you going to say if they didn't meet X criteria, then...
in that scenario, Senator, the legislature, other states have done this. The legislature establishes its own kind of grade scale. This is what constitutes an A, B, C, D, and F, and it's based on student achievement scores. So it's where every building is as of this year, and then the goal would be to improve a letter grade. So if the building,
That's not my question about that kind of letter grade. That's separate from the student. Does the student have to reach grade level? Does the student have to improve a grade level?
no, this is about the building. This is grading the building.
I thought we were looking at students.
Are you-
I thought
We
that
are.
was the goal.
We are because it's up to the schools to get those kids to improve.
And that's what I'm asking. For the child, are you going to have a realm, a range of improvement, or do they have to meet a target?
And again, this would be in Kansas. This has nothing to do with Kansas Justice Institute. This is what Kansas Policy Institute would like to see in an accountability system. It would be to show improvement. So in a letter grade environment, it's not getting everybody to the same level. It's a letter grade environment in that example where the building, because it's not, we want to see all kids improve. So if the building goes from a C to a B, then every employee in that building in our design would get a bonus. It doesn't get washed through the district. It goes directly to the building. If it doesn't improve, then nothing happens. But if it's an F-rated school, then we would like to see the students be allowed to leave with their state
Do
funding.
you have any examples in the United States where that's working?
Oh, sure. Florida has been doing A through F grading for
And where they
years.
give them a bonus?
I don't know that they give a bonus.
Thank you.
So we'd like to see rewards if there are. Next question.
Beginning, sorry, apologize, I was late. So you're announcing the formation of a Kansas Justice Institute. It's not operational at the moment, to become a new player in the school finance litigation.
To be representing citizens, and students would be included in that. It's modeled after the Institute for Justice, which is the national law firm for liberty. So Kansas Justice Institute would be handling a wide variety of issues, including school choice, but personal property rights, occupational licensing, civil asset forfeiture. IJ litigates to limit the size and scope of government and to ensure that all Americans have an opportunity to not have their civil liberties infringed upon. And Kansas Justice Institute will do many of those same things once we raise the money to get it going. This would be an independent, well, it depends. We don't really have an answer on that. It depends, frankly, with a law firm, it's how many cases you're going to take on. So you could start it out small, but if you're going to take on a big case, then you would have to have more money. So we don't have a number in mind right now. It will probably take us up to a year to raise the money to be able to get the organization started. And at that point, it would be an independent. Kansas Policy Institute just helps get these things started. Each of these independent organizations have their own board of directors, and that guides them. So we usually have a shared service agreement with the organization and KPI just so they can operate efficiently, and they just hire us to do their back office things like fundraising and marketing and so forth, just at our cost.
Mr. Moore, would you share that student data with us, or is it on the KSDE website?
I didn't bring any data with me.
Yeah, I mean, not right, but would you?
Oh, yes, I mean, more than willing.
Unless, I mean, if it's on the KSDE website, I'm happy to look for it. So is it there, or?
I don't know if it's on the KSD website.
Okay.
Can you say how many students are in your school?
There's 51 students.
Have you run any of this by the Activities Association? Are they just gonna chew you folks up?
The Activities Association?
Yeah. You're not gonna mess up football classifications.
Kansas State High School Activities Association, how's that gonna affect
No, I just
students
wonder,
participating?
have you talked to them or?
No,
I'm still not.
I don't understand the connection.
I'm not.
Okay, that's.
I don't think that's even relevant
to No.
what they're proposing.
No, basically, Martin, if a student, if it's not about how, what the fact is that they're not spending the money. Let's say that the legislature appropriated money, as the court suggested, for the 25% who aren't performing. But the legislature, excuse me, like in the past, forgot to say, and you can only spend it for that purpose. So if they got the money and they didn't spend it for that purpose, then that could be the basis of a suit. My education is not improving. You got the money, you're not using it for me. It has nothing to do with football or anything else.
Can I ask about the school choice?
Sure.
The Kansas Constitution requires the state to maintain a system of public schools. Where is the obligation to fund private schools or some sort of claim? Where do you get the claim
Mike?
that the state has a legal obligation to offer private school choice?
There is no constitutional provision requiring school choice. It is that the state has recognized that there's a constitutional right to an education. There's a constitutional right to a public education. And if you're not getting a satisfactory public education, there are options. Affluent families have always had that option. If they have enough money, they can pay all their taxes, but also then send their kids to wherever they want those kids to go. So with the recognition that education is a constitutional right, there ought to be a remedy, if, in fact, the 25% who the Supreme Court wants to target are not getting an education, then the remedy is a reallocation of resources to target them to the extent they stay in the public system, or provide them an opportunity to get an education, or their parents to allow them to get an education where they can get one, where affluent families already have that choice. So there's there's nothing in the Constitution that requires public funds to go to fund private institutions. That's not what this is about.
But you would be asking the Supreme Court to find that right in the Constitution, would you not?
I think they've pretty much, that ship has sailed.
That they found, that you think that the state Supreme Court has found a right in the Constitution for students to get an equitable and adequate education outside of the public school system? You think that they found that?
No, they've established a constitutional right to that education. So it's a right. And with the things that are required, the duties that are required, the failure to meet a duty gives rise to a cause of action. We're not saying that the remedy in every single case, and I don't think Dave is saying the remedy in every single case is to send a child from public to private. I know that's where you're wanting to connect the dots. That's not what they're suggesting necessarily, but it is an option. And it's an option that has worked in other places, and it's working in the state to the limited extent that we have school choice. It's working.
And not just at Wade School.
If we can't agree on anything else, it ought to be every single child in the state, not 75%, but 100%, have that opportunity. And there ought to be a consequence. There's a consequence for underfunding. We already know that. What about the consequence of just not allocating the dollars, not getting the job done? The Emerson School example, they found out that they'd have teachers that had given up on the students. They thought they could never get to proficiency, number one. And number two, acknowledge that they couldn't teach literacy. Okay, that's sad, but there ought to be affluent families in that faced with that situation would have the option of sending their child someplace else. The Emerson students didn't have that. And yet that's what exactly the expectation of our Supreme Court is that the resources be reasonably calculated so that child in the Emerson School District gets what the 7 Rose standards. And if the school itself acknowledges that they can't do that, then there ought to be a remedy, whether it's a remedy at law or whether it's a legislative remedy or what have you, whether it's savings accounts, education savings accounts, whatever. We need to do whatever we need to do to get that 25%, get the promise of an education to them and the dream of a higher education or dream of a good job. And Supreme Court itself has acknowledged that that's not happening. The good news is it's happening for a lot of kids. 75% of our kids are getting there. We're here to take care and represent, if nobody else wants to represent them, represent the ones that are not getting the promise of an education delivered.
Would you go so far as to say education is a fundamental right?
Excuse me?
Would you go so far as to say education is a fundamental right?
It is what the 4 justices, the plurality decision of the Supreme Court in 2005 said it was. And
They stopped short of saying fundamental right, I think.
Okay.
Carol
So-
Meyer put it in a...
So I read her concurring opinion over the weekend again. And so tell me again your understanding of the difference between a constitutional right established in Kansas as opposed to a fundamental constitutional right.
fundamental constitutional right,
Uh-huh.
which then would subject everything to strict scrutiny. Puts it on, if the state fails in its obligation to meet that.
So
right,
you're suggesting that by saying it's a constitutional right in Kansas, they fell short of creating
fundamental constitutional.
a right for the kids that are not getting an education to access the
I think
courts.
the argument-
I disagree that. I
The
disagree.
issue, Mike, the issue though is the scrutiny as to, right, as I think if I'm remembering that decision, they stopped short of imposing a scrutiny test that would basically have essentially set up a situation where the court could be a lot more, it could basically order the treasury drained to deal with this.
With all due respect, not be flippant, they've already ruled that the treasury can be drained if they say it.
Okay, maybe they can send people to jail.
And what they've done since then,
It's the burden of proof, not access to the court. It's not an access to court issue. It's the burden of proof once you make that
Yeah.
constitutional argument.
And since then, John, the Supreme Court has ruled that outcomes matter most. In fact, they said that it's quite possible, it's feasible that you could have adequacy met even though funding wasn't optimal, because if students are achieving the Rose standards, then it almost doesn't matter what the funding is, because the goal is to get the students educated. And so if the point here we're trying to make is that with the Supreme Court saying that outcomes matter most, and if the state is not doing what it can do, whether by in a variety of ways, giving money to schools for the express purpose of improving those outcomes, but allowing them to spend it however they want, then that's not standing up for students. It's not ensuring that students are actually that money is actually going to be used for them. So at some point, there has to be a remedy that stands up for students. The remedy can never be just give schools more money if you're not going to say, and use it for those kids. Use it for this purpose. The goal has to be students first, not institutions first, not money first. You know, we've increased funding in schools from $2 billion to $6 billion over the life of the previous school finance system. And we've gone from where we used to measure achievement gaps in decades to now we have to measure them in centuries. The time it would take at the average progress over the last 10 years, it would take centuries to close the achievement gaps between low-income kids and everyone else on both the ACT and on the NAEP scores. We have to change. More money just isn't the answer. Accountability has to be there.
At
Martin?
some point, do elected local school board members become defendants in this effort?
That's a legal question. I would leave that to attorneys to determine.
So if I'm having missed the first part of this, I don't want to, but your solution to school funding litigation is to create something that allows you to go in and sue and prolong school funding litigation, albeit in the interest of the children.
No, this would not be at all about funding. This is about actual education. And again, Kansas Justice Institute would not only work on those issues, but would spend, hopefully, most of its time on other issues that IJ works on, such as personal property rights or occupational licensing, civil asset forfeiture, things of that nature.
And I'll come back, and you and I need to talk about this a little bit differently, but there was a time when there was neither a cause of action for what we'd call educational malpractice, failure to deliver education, nor was there a right to sue for more money. USD 259 versus state, which was the previous precursor to Montoy, said no, state's not responsible for putting more money in. Montoy changed that and says you can sue for more money. And by the way, there's a constitutional right to an education. And then you have a situation where you can sue for all the money you can, but there's no consequence if you still fail to educate for whatever reason. And so the natural course of events would be to, particularly if you've got a state that's recognized as a constitutional right, the student has the same constitutional right as the district to ask for more money to ask for an education. So that's kind of where this is going, is not to promote litigation, but to raise the awareness with the legislature that if there's going to be an environment where you can keep suing year after year after year, decade after decade for more money, but there is no consequence for how the money is spent, and you've still left kids behind, not to resurrect the old title of the federal law, but you're leaving kids in Kansas are being left behind. The percentage is out there, and we can track every one of those students, and many of them are trapped, as Dave said, in a situation, compulsory attendance, compulsory coursework, in a school where you have no choice, but that's where you're going to go, and you're not getting the education that the state says you ought to have, notwithstanding an order for more money. What remedy would you propose? I mean, we're open to suggestions, but shouldn't there be a remedy for that child in some form or fashion, whether it's education savings account, whether it's an order for the court to reallocate funds, and this gets to the school board. School board approves these budgets and allocations, And there could be some, we're hoping that litigation is not necessary, but you have the school board saying, oh, no, we got some responsibility now. Here's our underperforming kids, here's our poverty kids, here's our at-risk kids. School, what are you doing? I'm a school board member. What are you doing to address those students? Because I'm going to have a vote on this. We want to get the conversation directed at the right thing, and that is the delivery of education, not how much money we're going to have in our budget next year for everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm going to wrap it up here and just to reiterate that the goal here is to avoid litigation. The goal here is to get students educated, to make sure that they have access to get the education they deserve. If not, then the Kansas Justice Institute will be prepared to represent those students and their parents so that they can get it. But hopefully, we'll have a school funding formula passed this year that will hold schools accountable, that any new money that's put into it will be just for those students, those 25% that the court said might need some more money because they're not performing, and that money will be required to be spent for their direct exclusive benefit. We hope that the legislature and the state will take steps to make sure that the money is directed to the kids and that they are doing everything they can to make sure that one way or another, these low-income kids who are not performing are getting the education they deserve. That's the ultimate goal of this organization. There's lots of other issues, as I said, personal property rights and occupational licensing and so forth that need to be addressed in Kansas. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll be around here. If you have a couple more questions, we'll be around, but I wanted to officially close it. Thanks.